So this is definitely going to be something different. I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here, knowing little to no biology. What I'm planning to talk to you about today, I'll use a little bit of climate tipping point motivation as a point of departure. I'll talk a little bit about sensitivity and feedbacks, which are what we think are key to producing tipping points in the climate system. And then that point of departure will be to motivate modeling and measuring in high-dimensional systems. So rather than getting down into the weeds and talking about the specific problems we work on in my lab, I thought for this audience it might be good to get up at a higher level and talk about the way we think about modeling, the way we think about measuring, and more importantly, what we do is fusing those two things together. So in many communities, perhaps yours is like mine, we have people who do modeling and people who do measuring. And I think we've reached the point in climate science and in weather analysis and prediction where the fusion of those two things, that is putting the measurements and the models together, is the most important way forward. And I'll give a little illustration of that toward the end, where we try and figure out where we can optimally place sensors in the environment to maximize some return on investment. Okay, so unfortunately, that's got a little strange there. Tipping points in climate change are typically caused by a threshold where the climate changes irreversibly due to some cause. And some examples I have here, and again, I'm sorry that they're all jumbled. I don't know why I'm using my own computer and they're jumbled on this screen, but the thermal halide circulation is one which is well known to produce, or thought to produce, tipping points in the climate system. So this is the overturning circulation in the ocean. It works on very long time scales, decades to centuries. It moves heat poleward. And it's thought that if that's disrupted, there can be abrupt change in the climate system. There can be a tipping point where we have abrupt change. This has been deduced from the paleoclimate record. It's also been simulated in climate models. But unfortunately, there's no agreement between those two things about exactly what the causes are for these tipping points. So this little diagram I have, is there a pointer here, laser pointer? This diagram here shows you multiple equilibria in this overturning circulation for what is effectively a certain range of precipitation or freshwater flow at high latitudes. And so we're right about here right now, and if we have a little more freshwater flux, we can get into these unstable equilibrium states, which can give us a rapid slowdown in the overturning circulation. So this is one thing that Hollywood has kind of popularized. Shut down the circulation, you can have really, really cold weather over North America and Europe. There are others, including more on polar ice and feedbacks between ice and albedo, the reflected radiation from the sun. This gives us things like snowball Earth, where we reach tipping points where when ice progresses to sufficiently low latitude, it can race to the equator and completely freeze the entire Earth. And in the opposite direction, if we eliminate polar ice, we can get to really, really warm conditions where we had crocodiles in the Arctic. And there are others that are more biologically related. So as I mentioned at the outset, it's really feedbacks that are critical to these tipping points. Let me spend a moment talking about those. And in particular, the uncertainty that goes as part and parcel with these feedbacks. So climate sensitivity is defined in the community as a change in the equilibrium state due to some forcing. And the forcing we've been thinking about for the past few decades is really radiative, something that changes the energy of the climate system, and in particular, the absorbing gases like carbon dioxide. Feedbacks are anything that reinforces, or perhaps does not, goes the opposite direction of the forcing. So one of the most familiar ones is what's called the water vapor feedback. As the Earth warms, the atmosphere can hold more water vapor, and water vapor is the most powerful radiative gas, greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, which provokes more warming, gives you more water vapor, and that's a positive feedback. Okay, so relatively recent paper on this, which accounted for uncertainty, shows that without feedbacks, a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere gives this reference sensitivity will give a temperature change of about a little over a degree. In the global mean, surface air temperature in the atmosphere. Now, for feedbacks like an amplifier, some of that gets cycled back in and can be expressed in terms of a feedback factor. So this 1 minus F is important because that feedback factor acts as an amplifier on uncertainty. So here's the feedback factor along this axis right here. And this Gaussian distribution shows in our models, we have some uncertainty in the feedback. Some of them are big, like that water vapor feedback, but there are many, many small feedbacks that are not completely understood. And in particular, they're not completely understood how they interact in this very complex system. So we have uncertainty. And that uncertainty gets mapped through this feedback, this 1 over F, which is this curve right here, into a range of uncertainty in the global mean temperature, which is decidedly non-Gaussian. In particular, it has a long tail toward catastrophic warming. This is why for so long, climate scientists have been beating the drum. We can't eliminate this catastrophic outcome. The expected value is perhaps something we can live with, but we've been trying to squeeze the uncertainty out of our climate models for 30 years, and this really hasn't budged. The uncertainty hasn't gone anywhere. We've gotten better at representing some things in the climate models, but at the same time, we've complexified the models. And that increase in complexity has enabled more of these small little feedbacks, which are keeping this tail alive. That's a problem if you're trying to make decisions about the future. Which leads me to this point of departure for the rest of my talk. How do we evaluate tipping point hypotheses? Not just in climate science, but many, many areas of science. As I said, we have measurements. Quite often, they're heterogeneous in space and time. And for climate, and perhaps for some of your fields, they're very noisy. And sometimes they're only by proxy. So for the climate record, we have direct instrumentation from the late 19th century to present. And before that, we're dealing with proxies, many of which are biological, that we really can't simulate from first principles in our physical models. And then we have those physical models, which provide us with this tremendous control of space and time through resolution and the processes that we include. Unfortunately, like I've said, there's been this temptation and a slippery slope toward complexification. We want to put as much of the system in there that we can. As was mentioned in the introduction, we are kind of the big computing problem, always have been. So as computers have expanded, Moore's law has allowed us to add more and more and more into these things. And we've lost sight of the fact, again, this is my opinion, I don't claim to represent climate modelers generally, I think a lot would disagree with this, but I would say that they're not Navier-Stokes solvers. Navier-Stokes are the underlying equations of fluid dynamics, and for dry fluid flow on the sphere, there are known exact nonlinear solutions that you can check your codes on. You'll know if they're right. When you start putting ice, clouds, radiation, forget it. There is no known solution aside from trying to reproduce the 20th century, which is what people have done. So what I think we need, the drum I like to beat, is we need model data fusion. There are benefits and problems with both of these things. We need to put them both together. So here is how I think about models and measurements and putting them together. I like to think of them as an information channel. That when we make a forecast, it's very much like placing a phone call on your cell phone. There is a receiver on our phone where we do some source encoding. So in the climate system, we have some measurements, and we need to encode that information into the models, the physical models that we're going to use to make the forecast, the prediction. The prediction is the other end of the line, the other person on the other phone. So those measurements get mapped into state variables by an encoding scheme. And this contrasts with a compression algorithm, which we're trying to squeeze it down to be as small as possible. What we'll see in the next slide is that we need to go the other way. We need to build in error correction. The next step is the channel encoding, and this is actually the system dynamics. How do we represent the dynamics of the system to relay the signal over the wire? Relaying the signal over the wire is the climate forecast, or it's the prediction of your system, what it might do now or in the future. So this is basically the information channel. And then we have source decoding. Once we have the receiver on the other end of the wire, we have to go back to either the voice that we're looking forward to hear, or in the climate system, the observations we're going to make in the future to verify our forecast. So there's this, probably what is one of the most important results of 20th century science is Claude Shannon's noisy channel theorem, which says, remarkably, that information can be reliably sent over a noisy channel at a rate up to the channel capacity with arbitrarily small error. That last phrase is the key, arbitrarily small error. That's amazing. The problem is, he doesn't tell us how to do it, and nobody else knows how to do it either, because it all comes down to these coding schemes. There's no known way, no one's going to hand you the box with the magical encoding scheme in it. You need to figure it out. That changes the probability of the inputs. Okay, so if you want to build in error correction, you consume some of this channel capacity. And that's what allows you to communicate with arbitrarily small error. So the problem is you eat your bandwidth, and in our case, the bandwidth is the computing resource that we have. And so just to make this as clear as I possibly can, something called a repetition code is we want to send ones and zeros over the wire, and there's noise on the line. Maybe we'll send 3 instances of the signal, and then we'll do democratic voting on the other end. But we've consumed some of the bandwidth by doing that. So the way we're consuming bandwidth right now is we're doing multiple realizations of the climate forecasts. We're accounting for uncertainty. We're doing what's called ensemble climate forecasting with many different physics packages, grid resolutions, and the like. But one thing I can pretty much guarantee you is the stock state bases that we have chosen, which are motivated by the classical laws of physics, conservation of mass, momentum, and energy, are not optimal. We like to think and measure temperature. It's almost assured that the coding schemes that will give us arbitrarily small error are not framed in these variables. So this is a wide open problem. As far as I know, very few people are thinking about this. But I would claim this is a potential opportunity for the next generation of models, both in climate and perhaps elsewhere. So let me get to the fusion part of the talk right now. So in my community, this goes by the term data assimilation or state estimation. In other fields, it's called recursive Bayesian estimation. There are filters, there are smoothers, and there's control theory. Control theory is where we alter the system. And in fact, that's come to the climate world now too. We have something called geoengineering, which is essentially control theory applied to the climate system. We have this cursive dimensionality for complex high-dimensional systems. Our models, as I've tried to motivate, are kind of this hybrid between first principles and statistical closures. And we have these limits on the measurements that we'd like to combine with the models. So I'll go through this really quickly. This is just to make sure we're all on the same page. Going back to high school, the first approach to estimation is one that Gauss took, is least squares. If we have a simple scalar, x, that we're trying to estimate with 2 measurements, y1 and y2, the key thing is that those measurements have error. And we need to know what that error is in terms of an error variance. Least squares minimizes the error in the thing we're trying to estimate, and you wind up with an estimator that's optimal, that minimizes the error, as a linear combination of the 2 measurements that we have. And these coefficients that sit out front depend upon those errors. So if the error in the first measurement is really small, we're not going to take y2. We're going to put all the weight on y1. And the important thing is that if you look at the error variance in the estimator, it's smaller than the 2 things that we started with. By fusing the 2 observations together, that's illustrated here on the graph. It's my first little bit of color. We have a probability density function which is narrower, has higher probability than either of the 2 things we had before. Fusion is good. Okay, another way of looking at this is that from a Bayesian perspective, if somehow or another we have a prior estimate of our system, and then someone hands us an observation, we can then incorporate that information to update our prior into a posterior. So through Bayes' rule, we wind up with a few things here. One is this probability of y given x is the probability of the measurement given the state. And that's not a probability density function, that's a likelihood function. It's a little like the difference between saying if I know a coin is 50-50 and I flip it 4 times, what are the odds I'm going to see heads every time? if I see heads every time, what's the likelihood the coin's fair? We're talking about the latter. Probability of x is this prior distribution, which we got somehow or another, and p of y is the marginal on the measurements. If we assume these things are Gaussian distributed, as I did before, we wind up with the same answer, that the expected value is this linear combination between these two things if the prior was the first observation. Okay? And then the variance is the same as before. Now we can generalize this into an algorithm where we can march the system forward in time, provided that we have a way to essentially move the prior into the future. That's the model. Okay, so the model takes our knowledge of the current and all past observations, this big Y t minus 1. That's our accumulated knowledge of the climate system forever, up to the current moment. And then our model takes it into the future, and that's going to disagree with the measurements we have in the future, and then we can update that. So that's a recursive algorithm. If we ever want to make a forecast, we do. From dynamical systems theory, we could say that our state x depends on some general nonlinear vector-valued function. It gives us a map to the state of the future. And this has an exact solution. This is an equation for the probability of that system. It's Fokker-Planck without the noise term, for those of you that know that sort of thing. It's a conservation for probability density, and it's dictated by the divergence of state space trajectories. And one of the amazing things is this has an exact solution. It's a linear first-order PDE. We can solve it exactly. This is the exact solution for the climate problem right here in one line. And it says that the probability density is controlled by this divergence of those state space trajectories. And what it says is that probability density decreases exponentially fast if we have divergence in state space trajectories. That's chaos. So if we have a sensitivity to the initial conditions and they spread out in time, our probability is going to flatten really, really fast. That's where the uncertainty is coming from. That's chaos. And the really bad news is any practical implementation of this is going to be many centuries off into the future, given the high dimensionality of this system. Okay, so this is a visual illustration. Here is the so-called Lorentz butterfly, a three-dimensional nonlinear low-order attractor, one of the original ones. And if we pick a little circle of states right here, some parts of the attractor, when we map these states forward, this shows future times, they kind of hang together. There's not a whole lot of divergence here. Other times, if we pick states that happen to go through the meat grinder at the bottom there, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. The trajectories are diverging all over the place. Our ability to predict the future is very, very limited. This is a tipping point. Okay? We see this in weather all the time. Sometimes we can make 10-day forecasts. They're fantastic. Other times we can't forecast what's going to happen 2 days from now because it's conditional. It depends on whether we're in a situation like this or we're near one of these tipping points. And the only way to know that is to have models we can trust and observations to constrain the system. So I've talked about, we've learned things in these climate and weather applications. Here's a taste of some of the practical solvers that we've, over the decades, come to use. And again, the number of degrees of freedom we're talking about here are on the order of about, for weather, about 100 million observations every 6 hours, and about 10 to the 8 degrees of freedom in our models. And we're doing this every 6 hours, forecasting out 2 weeks. Climate models or something similar to that. So we have something called 3D variational descent. It's a descent algorithm where we don't try and solve this as we do a Kalman filter. We're actually computing the cost function in its gradient and doing a steepest descent. We're basically groping around in state space, following the direction of maximum descent, and looking for the minimum. And that minimum is where we have the best fit between the model estimate of the state and the measurements that were taken. 4D VAR is a generalization into the time domain. It's essentially a smoother. We consider a window of time, and we are essentially trying to fit the state of the model to the observations that were taken in that interval. This has been the state of the art for about the last 10 years at most of the operational systems for state governments. And the one that's come over the horizon most recently is the one my group has been working on for about the past 10 or 15 years. We developed the first operational version of one of these things. And these are ensemble filters that do many, many realizations of the state. We do 100 forecasts. We do 1,000 forecasts so we can afford it. And then we use the statistics of the state as a means to do this assimilation. Well, why does this work? How in the world can we get away with this if we have a system with 10 to the 8 degrees of freedom and we only have 100 realizations of the simulation? And the reason why it works is that it turns out that the system is not as high dimensional as it seems. That it's really on the order, the effective dimensionality is on the order of 100 or 1,000, not 10 to the 8. Unfortunately, we don't know a priori what that smaller dimension is because it changes all the time. We have to simulate it to estimate it. So let me close out the talk by talking about optimal measurements. So at least in my field, the way measurements have made over time is networks have kind of grown organically for different purposes. So for aviation, for example, if you want to take off in an aircraft, you'd really like to be sure that they're measuring the weather conditions on the runway, right? But those long-term measurements have also been used to monitor climate. And it's not at all clear that those locations are optimal for monitoring the climate. And there are some places where it's really expensive or really difficult to make measurements, so we'd like to do this optimally. So the question is, given a limited resource, that is some financial constraint, and perhaps other constraints too, we can only go to certain locations, how do we optimally sense the system? The way we do this, we like to do it based on sampling theory alone. It's along the lines of this other research I've been talking about using ensemble estimation. Other folks have done this with adjoint models. These are kind of complicated twists on the forecast models that we have. And another thing that we've added is really pretty robust Monte Carlo uncertainty quantification. So let me just give you a one-slide taste of how we go about this. So the key thing is we have to have some performance measure. In fact, we can have multiple performance measures, but I'm just going to talk about one. We're going to call it J. And we're going to make a leading order Taylor approximation for J. And J depends upon our state. And X, again, is the state of the climate system or the weather that we're interested in. There's our leading order Taylor approximation. And then the expectation over the outer product of small changes in J with itself gives us the variance in J. And that depends to turn out on this sensitivity gradient, how J depends on the state, and this matrix A. Matrix A is the covariance matrix. It describes the relationship of all the state variables with one another, 10 to the 8 by 10 to the 8. The change in variance of J, that is how we squeeze the uncertainty in our knowledge of J, which is what we want, how can we make that optimally small, is given by this equation right here, which it turns out through a little bit of manipulation can be written right here. And due to lack of time, I'm not going to talk too much about this, other than to say this involves a covariance between point estimates of the state and some operator which replicates the measurement that we wish to take. So we can go around through our system and probe every degree of freedom and ask, how much does it reduce our uncertainty in the thing we care about? Once we find the one that has the maximum change, that's the place we go. If we want another one, we take the information that we estimate we will get from that first measurement, we take it out of the system, and we repeat the operation. And in that way, we can build a network that is optimal for estimating the thing we're interested in. So let me give you a specific example. This is something we're doing for the National Science Foundation, which runs a distribution of weather stations across Antarctica to support base operations down there. It's a very expensive network. It's very hard to maintain, hard to get certain places for monitoring weather and climate. So they asked us, can you reconfigure this network optimally using this theory? So in fact, that's what we're doing. And as soon as I get back this afternoon, I'm going to finish a proposal to actually do the field work to test these ideas. We've done the theory. We think we know where to go. This spot right here in what's called the Megadunes area of Antarctica is the best place to go to monitor the continent average temperature in Antarctica. If you could put one station down, that's it. We could tell you the latitude and longitude. The uncertainty here is by accounting for lots and lots of error in our calculation. So it's a relatively narrow region, but it's relatively sharply peaked too. So once we measure there, where's the next place we should go to get the second observation accounting for the information from this one? It turns out that's right here on the edge of the Ross Sea. Again, if we want a third one, it's over here. So we can answer this question objectively and rigorously, and this curve down here simply shows you relative to randomly chosen measurements. If we just went around randomly and placed these things around, we reduce the uncertainty, which is what's on the ordinate here, a whole lot more than a randomly chosen measurement. But there's nothing like going out in the field to test the idea, which is what we plan to do. Okay, so the last one I'll leave you with is my most colorful slide, and it's about the paleoclimate proxy problem. Very, very similar constraint. It's hard to get proxy measurements. If you want to understand the past climate system, where should you go? It turns out the tropical corals tell us a lot about the global mean temperature. We have a bunch of corals, but if we want to take the next one, where should we go? So this is a paper that we just submitted with some collaborators from USC. And the darker grays effectively show you where new corals would have the biggest impact. Lighter grays, lessers. And this calculation is constrained by where there are corals. We didn't say we'll go anywhere. And for ice cores, we're not going to drill ice cores in the middle of the ocean, right? So we can constrain this calculation to where the thing is that we can actually sample. So we think we know where to go to do this optimally. And incidentally, the blues are where the existing coral records are. Okay, so here's a summary. What I think I've told you. That tipping points involve cause and effect. And quite often there are hypotheses that come from models or that come from measurements. But our understanding is most rich and most complete when those two things are in harmony. And I would argue that that involves a fusion between these two things. I've tried to tell you about practical methods we have in high dimensions, not just for the climate system, but hopefully for your problems too. And the effective dimensionality really is the key. Even if you don't understand the linkages throughout your system, just the fact that they're there is really the key. If everything is really independent, you're hosed. That's, I think, one of my take-home messages. It really is a brute force calculation at that point. And ensemble sampling allows us, it's currently the most effective approach we have that's computationally effective to deal with this dimensionality. And for the optimal sensor placement problem, there's a theory out there for doing it. And it allows us to do something pretty cool, which is to place sensors to maximally use limited resources. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks for the talk. I mean, so my question is, when you talked about you have a set of equations, yes, there's a right part. You said you just refer as nonlinear. So my question, how you would actually infer that the functional dependencies? What do you use for that?
Right, so as I said early in my talk, in the climate system, we have this benefit of standing on the shoulders of giants, where these are basically discretizations of the classical physical conservation laws. So that f of x is conservation of mass, momentum, and energy, which has all these nonlinear inertia terms. But we know exactly what they are from continuum, the continuum approximation of fluid dynamics. The other part is there are statistical closures on that. So there are things like radiation. So we can't do ray tracing for every photon, right? So we're making a bunch of approximations. At small scales, we have to have a closure on small scale turbulence. For clouds, we can't simulate the process by which water vapor condenses on aerosols. So there's a part of that F that's rigorously well known, and then there's another part that we build empirically from doing field programs and building our basic understanding and trying to incorporate it. And one of the arguments I'm trying to make here is that our models are have become much more dependent on that second piece. If you come from a system where it has to be completely estimated statistically, empirically, then it's a whole different problem, and there's a whole different literature on how to do that. But the climate problem is more, we have some first principles equations that we are closing the system on. Does that answer the question? Good enough?